Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. Yes, I didn't realise that Al Reba had died. Very fine scholar and an exceptionally nice man, who I must have known for 50 years almost. All right. Look, what I'm trying to do is, in 1 hour, sum up my life and my career, which is actually very good mortification of the flesh for someone brought up, as a good Catholic. Summing up everything one's done in an hour puts one in it sees one in the proper small niche in the great scheme of things. Nevertheless, there is quite a bit to say, so I'd better stop chattering and get on. First and foremost, I'm a historian of Imperial Russia, and above all of late Imperial Russia. That was my thesis, which became my second book, Russia's Rulers Under the Old Regime, which was a study of the Russian imperial governing elite in the last 25 years of the empire. It was also, of course, my biography of Nicholas II, and the last book I wrote on Imperial Russia, actually my second last book, which, depending on whether you're talking about the American or the British edition is Towards the Flame, Empire, War, and the End of Tsarist Russia. The domestic political crisis, which ended with the disintegration, the fall of the monarchy and the disintegration of the empire, was by no means the only topic I covered in those books, but of course it was very much to the fore. And if I was going to sum up the crisis, at least from the perspective of the rulers, I would say that in his left ear, Nicholas II heard the advice of his more liberal ministers, and they basically said to him, Your Majesty, 20% of your subjects, and that is a very large number of people, given that you have 170 million subjects by 1914, are modern Europeans. They expect the same political and civil rights as their European equivalents. You cannot rule them through a system which is essentially rooted in 18th century conceptions of enlightened despotism, and even earlier, if you like, medieval conceptions of divine right monarchy, and expect to retain their allegiance or the legitimacy of your own regime. Either you make concessions or your regime will lose legitimacy in the eyes of the elites, the educated, and it will collapse. And I think they were basically right. The educated elites, the middle classes, and the old upper class in Russia were too numerous, too sophisticated, and too European not to demand the equivalent rights of their European peers. And when I first joined the profession, that was, roughly speaking, as far as most English language scholarship went in terms of Nicholas II. Oh, if only he'd been George V. Unfortunately for the last emperor, it wasn't that simple, because in his right ear, he had the advice of his most conservative and authoritarian advisors. And they said to him, 20% of the population may be, as the liberals have said, but 80% are not. They do not share a commitment to basic elements of European civilization, or whatever you want to call it, contemporary political understanding, including a commitment to private property, legal order, etc., etc. They said the majority of your population are peasants. The Russian, they would have included Ukrainian and Belarusian peasantry, has old collectivist instincts. They do not believe in the legitimacy of the private property of the great estates, the nobles, etc., etc. And the 1905 revolution proved that right. And they said you have the most radical working class in Europe. Partly, they argued, because it inherited the collectivist traditions of the peasantry, and indeed in that they were right as well, though you can argue two ways why the Russian working class had evolved to be the most radical in Europe. But the reality was there, again, as was shown in the 1905 revolution. And they said to him, less than half of your population are Great Russian, and we are in the age of ethno-linguistic base nationalism. That is an enormous threat to the survival of the empire. And they also said to him, we have, unfortunately, a very substantial revolutionary element in the intelligentsia, which is now making major inroads into the working class. And what they said to him is, if you dismantle the authoritarian police state, at least before we have had time to create, through land reform, a conservative peasantry on the German style, then we will have the disintegration of the existing social order and of the empire. There will be no halfway stage in Russia. If the existing authoritarian police state legitimized by the monarchy goes, European civilization and the empire in Russia will go with it. And I think they again had a point. And therefore the regime has a narrow room for maneuver. Doesn't necessarily mean it was doomed to fall, but from the perspective of the rulers, they had a narrow and winding path to tread in order to survive, and solutions to some problems exacerbated others. The second thing I am, as the subject of today's talk suggests, well, actually it doesn't, but I should have put it in, is that I'm an international historian, which above all means I'm a historian of international relations, geopolitics, war, diplomacy, etc. Now, to some extent, that overlaps with the fact that I am a historian of Russia. Most obviously when you're actually talking about the revolution itself, which was the absolute obsession of historians of Russia when I joined the profession in the mid-1970s. Just give you one little example of why I've said that. If the Tsarist regime, the monarchy, had collapsed in the winter of 1905-6, as it very nearly did, you would have had massive and almost certainly successful European intervention. There was no way in peacetime that the European great powers were going to stand aside while Russia seceded from the international system, set itself up as the headquarters of international socialist revolution, and expropriated the contemporary equivalent of trillions of dollars of foreign debt. Spearheading international intervention would have been Germany, which was always going to be the most important factor in any intervention, because Germany is not just Russia's neighbour, it is also the greatest military power in Europe. And I think, at least in the short to medium run, international intervention on the side of counter-revolution would have succeeded. In the winter of 1905-6, William II promises the representatives of the Baltic German community that if the monarchy falls in Russia and the revolution goes to even further to the left, as it certainly will, the German army will intervene to rescue them. And although the Kaiser's promises are not German policy, Germany would have had a very hard time standing aside and watching the expropriation of the Baltic German elites and middle classes and the murder of many of them, which would certainly have been the case had the Russian Revolution in the Baltic provinces been allowed to develop fully. Now wheel forward to what Germany does in 1917-18. Germany, which would have been the spearhead of international counter-revolution in peacetime, now pushes the Russian Revolution as far as it can to the left, for very obvious and justified geopolitical reasons in wartime. Lenin gets back to Germany, to Russia, care of the German General Staff. Even more important, for that crucial first year after the Bolsheviks come to power, they are allowed to consolidate their hold over the geopolitical core of the Russian Empire, where most of its population, most of its industry, most of its war supplies, its communication centres are, because Germany and the First World War mean that outside intervention is not possible. And it is the fact that the Bolshevik regime has already had a year to put down roots in the geopolitical core of the empire, which more than anything else is what secures its victory in the Civil War. It's crucial. So that is a way in which actually looking at the international context is already crucial for the issue which obsessed my contemporaries in Russian studies, which is why the revolution, why did it go the way it did? But of course, my interest in international history goes way beyond trying to understand the Russian Revolution. International history, and particularly international history from a Russian angle, was the subject of my first book, Russia and the Origins of the First World War. It was the subject of Russia against Napoleon. It was the subject of Towards the Flame, Empire War and the End of Tsarist Russia. And indeed, it played a large element, even not from just a Russian angle, in my last book, which I'll mention in a minute, called In the Shadow of the Gods, The Emperor in World History. Again, I'm hardly going to be able to sum up everything in those books in 2 seconds. But if I was going to make one general comment in a specifically European context, it would be this. From the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, down to 1945, the basic geopolitical fact about international relations in Europe and the European international system was that it was difficult but possible for a would-be emperor of Europe to conquer what I call the Carolingian core of Europe. That is a pompous way of saying Charlemagne's empire. It means France, the Low Countries, Western and Central Germany, and Northern Italy. The trouble was that at that point, the would-be emperor of Europe faced an enormous challenge on both peripheries. In other words, somehow he had to face and defeat British power across the Channel and Russian power whose centres were south and east of Moscow, beyond the Polish and Belarusian plain and swamps. Doing that was enormously difficult. Doing that simultaneously was even more difficult, just on the resources of the Carolingian core of Europe. One reason why it was very difficult was that the British and Russians, however much they disliked each other, and they usually did, were always likely to unite against any kind of would-be European emperor whose base was in the Carolingian core. Because anyone who controlled that core was a threat to their security and their ambition. So you had to mobilize a maritime power to defeat the British and a military logistical power to defeat the Russians simultaneously. That was difficult. It wasn't impossible. And Napoleon certainly could have defeated Alexander and driven Russia into a state of dependency on France in 1812. Most European observers expected him to do so. Actually, in 1917 to 18, the Kaiser's Germany achieved what neither Napoleon nor Hitler achieved. In other words, it did actually destroy one of the two great peripheral power centers, in other words, Imperial Russia. If Germany had not unnecessarily brought the United States into the First World War, just as the Russian Revolution was taking Russia out, then it was within Germany's power to win the First World War. You did not need victory on the Western Front to win the First World War. You needed stalemate and victory in the East. Above all, that victory would have meant the principle of Brest-Litovsk, an independent Ukraine, which was de facto a German protectorate. Without Ukraine, for all sorts of reasons I can't go into now, Russia would cease to be a great power in 1917. If Russia ceased to be a great power, Germany must dominate Central and Eastern Europe, and therefore must be the predominant power in Europe as a whole. I think it is fully arguable that it would have been better for mankind if the Germans had won, but that is another issue, and these are counterfactuals which are very difficult to balance. I don't say that it would have been desirable. Handing East Central Europe over to the tender mercies of Erich Ludendorff is not a good solution, but it would probably have avoided a Second World War, Hitler, Stalin, and the Holocaust. So one is dealing with the worst of the worst against the worst. Also, all right, so I'm a historian of Imperial Russia and an international historian. I'm also a comparative historian, and the reasons for that I will not talk about now. I'll talk about, if I have time, later. They have to do with the fact that by complete accident, really, or by the accident of Cold War appointments in the Russian field, I spent most of my career not in a history department, but in a politics department at LSE. I was 31 years in the politics department. I was head of the politics department, despite never being a political scientist. And that certainly encouraged my interest in comparative politics. 3 of my books are completely comparative. Aristocracy in Europe, Empire, the Russian Empire and its rivals, and my last book, In the Shadow of the Gods, The Emperor in World History. But actually, increasingly, all my other books had a large element of comparative and broader contextual history as well. Above all, though, my comparative career meant my career as an imperial historian. That is the area in which I made my biggest contribution to comparative history. And you can see, in a way, when I define what I mean by empire, how that interest in imperial history overlapped with my interest in international history and indeed in Russian history. The book I wrote, Empire, the Russian Empire and its Rivals, was precisely designed to put Russia in the middle of a comparative history of empire, Russia and the Soviet Union. My definition of empire was and is partly a polity of enormous scale, partly an enormous diverse polity, above all ethno-linguistic diversity, but by no means only. And the point about that is that if you take scale, scale is crucial to the enormous resources which were of the essence of empire. But they were also part of the enormous challenge of governing an empire, especially with pre-modern communications. I think if you were going to generalize, you would say that modernity made the problem of scale somewhat easier because technology shrank space. It made the problem of managing diversity harder because of the politicization of ethnicity and the increasing hegemony of the idea of national identity and national sovereignty rooted in ethno-linguistic historical definitions of nationality, and of course in the principle of popular sovereignty. But although those are my two of my three key points when it comes to a definition, my most important one is power. It seems to me that if you are not a polity powerful enough to have dominated the international relations of a region for a significant period, you're not worth calling an empire. And I do absolutely and definitely stress hard power, military, political, economic. I think it has been a great weakness of historical study in my lifetime that there has been an increasing shrinking from the study of hard power. That looks even more foolish right now when we are probably looking at 250 years of Western and Anglo within Western hegemony in the world coming to an end, with enormous possibilities of conflict as a result. But of course, I am very far from arguing that power is just hard power. How could someone who came to the study of empire actually from the perspective of looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union rule out the enormous importance of soft power, ideology, culture, you name it? So I'm meaning power in the round. And if I was just going to finish off this little section, I would add that, yes, I'm a historian of Imperial Russia. Yes, I am an international historian. Yes, I'm a comparative historian. Yes, I'm a historian of empire. I'm also in a kind of way a historian of opposites. Historians are sometimes divided between splitters and lumpers. Those who like grand generalizations and those who like macro history, narrative, biography, accident, you name it. I really am both. And that, is very much part of my books. Look, the last book I wrote, which came out in 22, called In the Shadow of the Gods, the Emperor in World History, was a study of what it meant to be the ruler of an empire over 5 millennia and across the whole world. It was of course, it was to do with structure, and it was studying hereditary monarchy as a system of government, looking at geopolitics, but it was also a collective biography. So it was precisely the tension between structure and agency, and that to an extent has run through all my work. All right, end of section one. How did I get there? How did I get to be these things? Why does anyone become a historian? We've become historians for different reasons. Many people become historians in order to understand the present, to try and get a grasp of where it, and therefore they, came from, possibly to try and predict the future. And of course, we all know about the great philosophies of history, Marxism being the most obvious. And although, Marxism has taken a major hit in the last 30, 40 years, it is, after all, in a sense, the product of the Enlightenment, the product of British political economy, and the product of a more basic feeling in Western society that history is linear progress, etc., etc. And that basic instinct is very strong. And I'm not necessarily against it. All I would say is that I personally do believe very strongly that a knowledge of history is crucial certainly to statesmen. Some of the most egregious, in fact, I think the most egregious political failures and miscalculations in my lifetime have come from
ruling elites and leaders who did not understand history. Nevertheless, I would be lying if I said that I became a historian primarily because I thought the past was an important way of understanding the present or predicting the future. I didn't. Above all else, I became a historian because as a child and an adolescent, my imagination was enthralled by the stories told me by older relatives. And that takes me back to that brief quote which Carsten read out to you, before I began. I absolutely don't rule out the importance of studying history to understand the present, etc. But I do also think it is extremely important to use your imagination and to try and think yourself back into the mentalities of people who, by definition, did to some extent have different values, because that is an important education in understanding different perspectives, cultivating the imagination, which is actually crucial, both for managing the present world and steering ourselves, if we can, into some future which doesn't end up with destroying us all and our grandchildren. All right. Look, I am a historian of Imperial Russia above all else, and that is in a sort of way where my family came from. So you might think that, what truly enthralled me above all else in my childhood and adolescence were stories told me by my father's relations. Not really. The values which dominated our childhood and adolescence were above all those of my mother's side, which you could sum up as British Imperial and Catholic. My mother was what was described as a castle Catholic. Her in other words, that element of the Catholic elite which was basically loyal to the British Crown in Ireland and the Empire. Sometimes equivocally loyal, but basically loyal. Her great-grandfather had been the first Catholic Chief Justice in Ireland since the 17th century. Her father was a senior British judge in India, etc. But the person who really got my mind going in terms of history was my mother's mother, my grandma, who was a wonderful person and had a flat in our house in London. And she was born in British India. She went back, as British children did, to high school. But then she came back to British India to marry, and she spent the most interesting decades of her life. And most of her stories, which she told me in childhood, were really about British India. They were not necessarily always very, in inverted commas, useful, because I was, even at the age, at a young age, I was already extremely overexcitable and impressionable. My grandma's idea of a good bedtime story was a story about man-eating tigers and man-eating leopards, which had a dramatic impact on me. I lived on the 5th floor of our house in central London. I nevertheless went to sleep with cricket balls, knives, torches, even a compass, in case a man-eating tiger came up the stairs and, ate me. The compass was there in case the man-eating tiger took me off to Kensington Gardens, which was just around the corner, and forgot to eat me entirely, so I had to get home. Anyway, even at quite an early age 6, 7, I still remember some of the things my grandma told me, and they really sort of remember them, sort of suddenly making me sit up a bit. She, like, upper middle class girls of that era, she went off to finishing school in Europe, and since she came from a rather serious background, she went off to Dresden. And I remember her telling me her acute surprise that if you went out, of course, in the most respectable fashion, with a young officer, and there were no places at a cafe or a restaurant, someone would always stand up, give up their place for the officer and his lady. And she said that she'd never seen that in British India, let alone in Britain. British civilians would never do that, and nor, I think, even would respectable Indians, the citizens. Incidentally, her great buddy at this ladies' finishing school was someone called Elsa Kleberg, and the young lieutenant she remembered best was the young man who was going out with Elsa at that time and later married her, Erwin von Witzleben, who later became a field marshal and would have been the commander-in-chief of the armed forces if the July plot had succeeded. Instead, he was murdered by Hitler. Very decent young man, she said. As I got older, though, it was sometimes, in fact, increasingly often the oddities and the silences in the stories which, above all, attracted my attention. my grandma's father was really my only sort of middle-class great-grandfather, was an interesting character of missionary origin. He was a very successful lawyer, an amateur historian, rather a good amateur historian of the Mughals, and one of the earliest members of what became the Indian Congress Party. And after the death of my great-grandma, with a courage which was relatively rare by the 1890s, he married as his second wife an Indian woman. His second wife and my grandma's great lovely sister by the first marriage were assassinated in 1908 by Bengali Indian revolutionists. It's a very famous case because it's the only time that so-called white women were killed in British India between the revolt of 1857 and the end of the Raj. Of course, it was an accident. The poor young men who drove the bomb mistook the carriage for that of a deservedly unpopular British senior official. What is fascinating, though, is that neither in the British nor in the Indian historiography, which is considerable, of a very famous case, is it ever mentioned that one of the women killed was an Indian. Both the British and the Indians had the reasons for not saying that. The other great silence was the only product of that marriage. I remember my great aunt Margaret was a wonderful character, half Indian. My mother said we must never ask her about the impact of being mixed race in the Britain and the British Empire of that time because it was too painful. She was a wonderful woman, full of guts. Actually, I think if we'd asked Aunt Margaret, she'd have given us a straight answer. But it is fascinating, the things you would long to have asked but never dared. Anyway, I mean, that British Imperial and Catholic identity essentially blew up in the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s because of the social, cultural, sexual revolution of that era. And into the gap moved the world of my father, the world of the Russian Empire, to whose study I have, after all, devoted most of the rest of my life. And when you devote most of your life to the study of a world from which your own family comes, you do increasingly identify with it. At least I did. I mean, that doesn't mean that that world was never there. It was there, but it was in a secondary position. The most spectacular embodiment of that world in my childhood was my great-aunt Alexandra, Alika, in other words, my father's aunt. She had been a nurse with the Russian army in Persia in the First World War. After the revolution, rode down over the Khyber Pass into India, married this English grandee, sort of grand bourgeois, who later became Lord Mayor of London. He had pots of money, so she was the only one of us who still was, very comfortable despite the revolution. And she was a remarkable old character, particularly for a slightly shy and strange boy who they were trying to bring up as an English gentleman, because she used to take us off periodically, my elder brother and sister and I, to the zoo to feed the yaks. The thing is, the Russian army used yaks as transport animals. Aunt Alika fell in love with the yaks, was convinced that the yaks spoke Russian. So would take us down to the zoo to feed chocolate eclairs and meringues to the yaks and talk Russian to them. My conviction was that Russia must be a very interesting place, because whereas English cows were 3 times smaller, not furry, and ate grass. Russian cows, yaks, were 3 times bigger, very furry, and ate chocolate eclairs. That was an early sort of fascination. Some of my memories of her were a bit more serious. I remember going to have tea with her when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And she's told me that when she'd gone to tea with her godmother, aged 7, her godmother, who was an old lady by then, was the daughter of a man called Karl Nesselrode, who'd been the Russian foreign minister and chancellor under Alexander and then Nicholas I. And her godmother had said to her that when she was 7 years old, her father was at that point number 2 in the embassy in France before 1812, and the leader, the boss of the Russian very successful espionage operation against Napoleon's France. Brilliant. She'd gone to bed as normal and then very abnormally was woken up 3 hours later, her hair very carefully brushed, put into her best nightrobe, and her mother came up and took her down the great stairs of the embassy into the reception rooms to make her curtsy to the Emperor Napoleon, who was visiting the embassy. Well, even at the age of 6 or 7, my little years, that was something. To understand Aunt Alec, you have to understand something of her parents, in other words, my great-grandparents. That's still just about going all right. Her great-granddad was a big landowner in the Baltic provinces, one of perhaps the richest of the Baltic landowners. His main estates were in Kulin, but he had big properties in Livonia. But actually his biggest source of wealth was not the properties in the Baltic provinces, nor indeed the properties in Russia. He was the owner of what became, well, the mines of the settlements that are now called Donetsk. In other words, the core of the Ukrainian coal mining industry. So, this is a wealthy man. He was also a man who, by the way, he let the mines to a Welshman called Hughes, which is why they were called, the whole area was called Hughes before the revolution. 10, 15 years after he died, his widow sold them, the mines to Hughes, because it was far easier to invest money in Baltic land, state bonds, railway bonds, than it was to try and run a large mining industry. He also played a sort of political role. He was the marshal of the Livonian nobility, because the marshal of the Livonian nobility by convention was always the senior of the three Baltic marshals. And he was marshal at an important time because this was the 60s, the so-called second land reform. And it was very important for the Baltic nobility that their marshal was well in Petersburg. The thing is, well, my great-granddad was Lord Chamberlain of the Imperial court, but he'd known Alexander II since he was a child, because his uncle had been Alexander's mentor as heir apparent. And his grandma, my great-great-whatever grandma, had been the adored governess and second mother of Alexander's father, Nicholas I. So he was really in close. And that mattered in terms of, the land reform. If you ask my great-grandfather what nationality he was, because it would have been meaningless, he would have said he was Russian, by which he meant he was a loyal subject of Alexander II. He had some reason to be a loyal subject, since the Romanovs had sort of buried us in gold, estates and God knows what, over 4 generations. But then that kind of allegiance is a very old-fashioned feudal allegiance. And it is, after all, allegiance to a man who may have been Emperor of Russia, but also described himself as the first gentleman of his empire. These are mentalities and values and loyalties which are not part of the modern world. My great-grandfather would have written his memoirs in French if he was going to write them in anything. Look, he spoke 8 languages. What possible ethno-linguistic, identity can you have? He was in no meaningful sense a German, in the sense that, he was very proud of being part of the Baltic German Ritterschaft. But that didn't give any sense of identity, even with the German population of the Baltic provinces, let in any sense, more broadly. They were in any event intensely proud of, truly or mythologically, being the descendants of the Livonian chieftains, who sort of basically sold people into slavery in the late 12th century when the German knights arrived. So it's complicated. This is a different world. Class, religion, history, family matter, not ethno-linguistic identity. As for his heart and his head, in many ways they're in Rome. He was a passionate classical scholar. He spoke very good and read, Latin and ancient Greek. And even more to the point, as a young man, he fell terribly in love with this young Roman aristocrat, with who was his mistress for 40 years, 35 years. I mean, the sad thing was that at the age of 15, she'd been married off to a cousin, another member of the great, one of the great Roman aristocratic families. And divorce was inconceivable. And inevitably, he wasn't interested in women. The old Principe was perfectly decent about it all. He fully accepted their children as his own. But, you could have a divorce in that world. Actually, when I was a child and early adolescent, there was this Roman principessa who floated around, particularly in the sort of world of my uncle and aunt. It was only when I reached a respectable age it was explained that she wasn't actually really so much a sort of family friend. She was our illegitimate second cousin. The problem was, of course, that this was all very well, but he was a very rich man. And he had no brother. So, he had to find less. So he was forced at the age of about 55 to marry his second cousin, the Countess von der Parland, who was half his age, not at all interested in men, very interested in horses, and even more interested in God. She produced 5 children. He dropped dead, and she took to religion on a grand scale. Interestingly, the last time I was in Russia was 2019, and the Russian evangelicals and Baptists had a huge celebration in our old palazzo. And our great aunt Vera Gagarin's palazzo, which was next door on Bolshaya Moscow. we had Vera Gagarin on one side, my aunt. We had the German embassy on the other side, and the Nabokovs were 3 doors down. You know, this is central aristocratic St. Petersburg. And all these people came up to me and said that my great-grandmother was a saint. You even had people come out to touch me. I was a kind of very strange thing. And of course, in some senses, you know, she did. She turned the palazzo over to good works, rescued prostitutes, or, you know, the whole caboodle, vast prayer meetings, etc. But her reputation in the family was certainly not that of a saint, because she was so convinced that she was, well, you combine aristocratic arrogance with the arrogance of, you know, people who think that God is speaking through their mouth, and that's quite a combination, you know. She basically locked up her children to protect them against sin, and inevitably made a better job of it with her daughters than her sons. Her eldest daughter, my great aunt Mary, just couldn't stand it, ran off to Switzerland, abandoning her money to become a nurse at a children's hospital. The children's hospital burned down. She sacrificed her life to rescue the children. Took an extremely agonizing month to die, and my saintly great-grandma wouldn't visit her on her deathbed because she said she was a disobedient daughter. So, you know, and that actually, you know, when you know the inside story, yes, there was huge wealth and privilege and all that. There wasn't necessarily much happiness always. And it's not a coincidence. We had this lovely old friend called wonderful Merike Kleinmichel, who after the death of the Grand Duchess Xenia was the sort of doyen of the white emigration in London. She was a Mecklenburg-Strelitz morganatic. She was the second cousin or third cousin of Nicholas II's poor children. Wonderful, lovely character. Her only problem for any woman, but most of all for the head of the white emigration, was that she was the split image of Brezhnev, as if she'd been his twin sister, eyebrows and all. Anyway, but she said that Aunt Annika had stormed into their palazzo on Fontanka in central Petersburg in 1915, en route to Asia, to Persia, to be a nurse, saying, freedom at last. And actually, when you look at things from the female point of view, and the females in my family are usually more interesting than the males, even in the public sphere. You know, my great-granddad, the person I've been talking about, one of his sisters ran off to London and became part of the Marx and Herzen circle, paid for a lot of the German revolutionary emigres of 1848 to get to America, buried close to Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery in London. And actually, again, when you talk about the member of the family who I knew best and who told most stories, my father's elder brother, Leonid, who was only 8 when the revolution happened. And he was a tremendous conservative. He was a lovely old man, very close to the Grand Duke Kirill and then the Grand Duke Vladimir, the heads of the Romanov family in emigration. So very conservative. Nevertheless, again, it's the anomalies which are so striking. He told me lots of stories, but the one which was most sort of shocking, moving, really got me stirred up. I think probably because it got him stirred up. In the revolution, in early September 1917, my grandfather lived on a big estate in northern Latvia. The Latvian countryside in 1917 was very radical, more than the Russian usually. And this was a big estate. It also had a small town situated sort of at the foot of the hill, which the manor house was built. And the local Bolshevik Soviet arrested my granddad and was going to shoot him the next morning. Locked him up in the estate steward's house, or maybe on the other side of the sort of square outside the manor house courtyard. And my uncle remembered, 8 years old, locked in the nursery, waiting for his dad and his sister as well, my Aunt Mary, their dad, to be shot the next morning. The local Russian regiment, the officers tried to rescue him. It was a Siberian regiment. The men were not so much hostile as just blind drunk, so things were looking pretty grim by 2 a.m. At which point, my uncle recounted, and my aunt, there was this huge noise coming up the hill, and this was the local Jewish community, headed by their rabbi, who stormed their way up the hill, scared the living daylights out of the Latvian Bolsheviks, and freed my granddad. And the reason they did that, he was, I remember in his old age, he was a very kindly, very Christian kind of character. He built schools and orphanages and hospitals. There's still a spectacular hospital he built, and power stations, so all the people on the estate had free electricity, And he insisted that the Jews, like everybody else on his estate, should have free access. And since he subsidized the building of lots of Christian churches, this was a big estate, he also insisted on subsidizing the synagogues. And at the moment when it really mattered, in August, September 17, the Jewish community came up trumps and saved his life. As a result of which, whereas most of the white emigrations, of course, viciously anti-Semitic, my granddad would never have a word said against the Jews. He said that of all the people he'd ever been kind to, they were the ones who really remembered and, got stuck in to rescue him. Okay, I'm going on for too long. Oh, Jesus, I am going on for too long. End of section 2. Well, you can imagine, with this baggage, I entered the study of Russian history from, you might describe as a very unusual direction, as regards, young people in the West entering doctoral programs in Russian history in 1974, 75. You have to remember that the study of Russian history at that time is dominated by the Cold War context, really. Everything is about the revolution, its origins, why it happened. To put things crudely, but not entirely wrongly, as regards the revolution, Western historians are divided between so-called optimists who argued that Russia was on the way to constitutional liberalism, possibly democracy, no war, no socialist revolution. And the other side, the so-called pessimists, who said that Imperial Russia was doomed and some kind of radical socialist revolution was almost inevitable. And this, of course, bore directly on the legitimacy of the Soviet regime, and therefore was very much part of the ideological struggle, which was part of the Cold War, very big part of the Cold War. Then you have to remember that my generation is the generation of the 1960s, of the revolt against their elders. Many of my peers were studying Russian history, or the Russian revolutionary period in general, out of sympathy, and indeed out of interest in some kind of alternative to Western liberal capitalism. And they were also, particularly the Americans, they were the products of the anti-Vietnam generation. And the one thing they hated on above all else was military history, foreign policy, all the justifications put forward for the war in Vietnam, etc. And unsurprisingly, therefore, this is also the era in strictly historiographical terms of history from below. People studied the workers, people studied the peasants, and particularly in terms of Russian history in the West, they were at the core of my generation's efforts to understand the revolution specifically and late imperial history in general. Well, as you might say, I didn't quite fit in. And I do actually, it's a great tribute to my colleagues, also my friends in Britain, who were fellow historians of Russia. We always got on fine. We were interested in each other. We didn't necessarily agree on it. I learned an enormous amount from them. And I think, some of them were kind enough to say they learned from me. So it was great. It's a great argument for keeping your personal, political, or family, prejudices, or whatever you want to call it, to the side and being able to concentrate on trying to understand the past from as many points of view as possible. Anyway, we were very fortunate in that our generation, we weren't the first, we were the second, really, or the second half of the first, were able to go off and work in Soviet archives. So in 1976 to 7, I spent a year in Soviet archives. Now, arriving on the scene, I was in Moscow. I was, as you might say, a hot potato. Soviet propaganda was not always wrong. My dad was exactly what Soviet propaganda said. He was an emigre Svetlishi Knyaz. He was a former senior officer of British intelligence, and he had been the head of the Russian service of the BBC. By the time I got there, he was the head of British broadcasting to the communist world. As you can imagine, there was no great rush of volunteers in Moscow State University history faculty to supervise me. Quite apart from this, the week I went in to see my supervisor for the first time was the week that Alexander Solzhenitsyn came home to dinner in London, which was probably not unknown to the Soviets, to the KGB anyway. And I was assigned this character called Chemensky, and I was told that he was an old Stalinist, horrible whispers about him being a donostic, the works. I have no way of knowing whether any of this was true. I thought Chemensky, I read his books, I thought by the standards of the time, they weren't bad at all. All I can say was he was wonderful to me. I stopped in very nervously to see him the first time, and he said to me, "Look, your main archives are in Leningrad. Why have they sent you here?" Well, I said, I asked to go to Leningrad, so they sent me here. Bloody idiots, he said, typical bureaucrats, and probably gave me a 6th month commandirovka to Leningrad, unheard of. Because I worked rather hard in Moscow in particular, every now and then I got kicked out of the archives for being, and blow me down every time the next morning I'd be back in, thanks to Chemensky. So it was great. Working in the Soviet archives was not easy. For instance, we were not allowed to look at the opposite, the indexes. Well, an archive, as you might say, has rather a large collection of papers. Can you imagine coming in, starting off your university studies and being told that there was a 10 million word book you had to find everything you needed in, but unfortunately there was no index, nor any chapter headings. The point was that you were only supposed as a foreigner to be able to look at materials which Soviet historians had already looked at and cited. You mustn't find something new. And we were all assigned so-called satrudniki. They were almost always satrudniцы, women, in fact, who in theory were there to help us, and in fact were there to keep an eye on us. And the great thing about Russia is that very, very often things don't work the way they're expected to by the state and by anyone else. My satrudnica regarded me as her sort of slightly favourite, slightly goofy, but very hardworking and, benevolent nephew, carried me round in her shopping basket like a little dog, whose nose up every night. She never broke the rules. She never showed me the opposite, but she sat in corners of the archive and read them out aloud to me. There was nothing in the rules against that, She also gave me a running commentary on, an opposite is not index. If you've got someone sitting next to you who's worked in the archive for 30 years and gives you a running commentary about what's actually in. And the best archival service I've ever had in my life. In theory, you were only allowed to order new documents, and you're going to get 5 at a time after you'd finished the old ones. So you had a week doing nothing, 3 or 4 days. She let me order new documents when I got the previous ones. Sometimes she ordered documents for me under her own name. So I would sometimes get 100 documents a day. A Soviet system which was designed to thwart everyone, and particularly people like me, actually worked in my favour to a dramatic extent. That doesn't mean life was easy. It wasn't. I lost 1/4 to 1/5 of my weight in Russia out of the general in that year, in the general excitement. Nevertheless, it was fantastic and was the basis for, my book, Russia Ruled Under the Old Regime. I think, sum it all up. Out of that, this everything I've said, I would say, 1, avoid presentism. Keep contemporary politics out of historical study to the extent you can. 2, try and preserve academic links across, in those days, Cold War or any geopolitical and contemporary political struggles. Of course, I am not so naive to believe that in the middle of a war, as we are now, one can preserve that principle. But to the extent one can, keeping academic links going is a good idea. Thirdly, and this was something we all felt, none of us, by the time we'd been in Russia for a Soviet Union for a year, ever took seriously anyone who said anything about Russia who hadn't spent considerable amount of time being there. The point is that what seemed inconceivable before you'd been there seemed inevitable after you'd been there for a year. I could tell you many stories about this, including the story of my roommate. We shared a block, not a room. Was a very nice but very conservative provincial Englishman who, as a result of a year's stay in the Soviet Union, turned into an anarchist, a pickpocket, a forger, and a brilliant person who broke his way through locks. Astonishing character, with all, he developed exactly the same kind of skills that some of these British characters in prisoners of war camp in the Second World War did. All right. So that brings me on to trying to get a job, that happy moment, in a young academic's career. In theory, I probably should have got a junior research fellowship in Cambridge. I got the top first in my year in Cambridge as an undergraduate, and in those days that should probably have meant that you got a research. But I didn't even get an interview, for which there were a number of reasons, good and bad. But undoubtedly the most important one was that the person my work was given to review was E.H. Card, who may or may not mean something to you. This was the absolutely pro-Soviet, the most, and you could not have had a more hostile reviewer if you'd asked for it. So I didn't get, even an interview, which was depressing. 3 months later, I got a tenured job in the politics department, a permanent job at LSE. having never read a word of political science in my life and my entire knowledge of Soviet history being one undergraduate essay. And again, there were some good reasons for that appointment. But again, it was the product of the impact of the Cold War and ideological differences within the Western world and specifically Western academia as regards appointments. About a month after the interview board, which gave me this job, I was asked to lunch by the head of department, Eli Kedori, who probably wouldn't mean anything to any of you, but was a wonderful scholar, but very much to the right. The point also being, of course, that the people who had developed and ran the Russian MSc, which I was appointed to help teach, Leonard Shapiro and Peter Redaway, were well to the right of your average Sovietologist, and certainly didn't want a mainstream, let alone a left-wing Sovietologist who would have messed up their program as far as they were concerned. Anyway, at the end of the lunch, Eli said to me, and I think this was because he knew my background and he was Jewish and thought maybe I was an anti-Semite, whatever other sins I may have had in life, that is not one I have ever had. Anyway, what he said is, we don't care what you think or say, meaning, as I say, you can, as long as you hate E.H. Carr as much as we do. Now, he knew nothing about my own private. That tells you something of the reality of academic appointments in my world at that time. So, and this is the last really main bit, here you have a historian of Imperial Russia who, even by the standards of historians, is interested in the past for itself more than in order to see credit, suddenly finds himself in a politics department, where he then stays for the next 31 years, including becoming head of the department, despite never really believing a word of political science. And if that was odd at the beginning, it gets odder, because in the course of my stay, political science goes off in the direction of rational choice and models itself on the economics department, and increasingly writes its articles in mathematics. In the end, it takes, just after I've gone, but the battles are going on while I'm there, takes over the LSE politics department. Well, of course, I can't understand a word. I don't speak mathematics. I can't understand a word these people are saying. But meanwhile, the history departments are going off in the other direction. Cultural turn, language faculties, you name it. So when I finally get to Cambridge, because the international history department at LSE was a bit of an anomaly, when I finally got to Cambridge, thank God I wasn't teaching, and I give talks, I get these queer looks, queer in the old-fashioned meaning of the word, and bewildering questions, especially from the students, because they've all been brought up on, particularly when it comes to empire, post-colonialism, and they're simply asking me questions. I do not understand what they're saying. They may be speaking English, but this is as alien to me as mathematics. It's all cultural theory jargon. So I've simply fallen through a hole. But somehow survived, If you were going to ask, and we probably haven't got time to do this, so I won't, but I mean, it did have, sitting in a politics department, certainly did have an impact on the way I thought, the way I approached subjects. I mean, comparative history would be an obvious one. I've spoken about empire, and it was by no means always a bad impact. You're welcome to ask me about that. I think, it helped me to think more clearly, certainly on the big structural issues very often. And I must say, just to give you one tiny example, when I wrote my book on Nicholas II, I had read, of course, vast amounts on the poor man. But actually, in all the English work I read, I think the one which had the biggest influence on me and really struck me as novel was a book by a man called Sam Huntington called Political Order in Developing Societies, and particularly his chapter, which was called The King's Dilemma. Now, Sam Huntington didn't, I think, even mention the word Russia in that chapter. He certainly didn't mention the word Nicholas II. But his comments about the king's dilemma, hereditary monarchy, old dynasty being inherently a conservative institution, and what happens when that conservative institution is forced for political and geopolitical reasons to become the spearhead of modernization, that taught me more about Nicholas II, without mentioning him, than every work I ever read in English, which on Russian history. But quite apart from the conceptual, intellectual impact of sitting in a politics department, it also had a very practical result. I think I've got about another 10, 15 minutes. Is that right? Yeah. The thing is that my supervisor, Hugh Seaton Watson, and my academic godfather at LSE, Leonard Shapiro, these were the people who created Margaret Thatcher as the Iron Lady. Whatever she knew about the Soviet Union, they taught her. And when Leonard died in 1983, Hugh put me on, in Leonard's place, Margaret Thatcher's Foreign Policy Advisory Council, and onto a committee of the former senior intelligence and security bosses of the British state. On the latter subject, I'll say nothing except that that was the cause of the most exciting seminar, potentially exciting seminar, I ever participated in, because the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, decided to blow us up. The security people didn't see this, as always. They looked all over the room and everything. Look, we've got the commander in Northern Ireland. We've got the head of the, I think, MI5. We've got the head of special. The whole, it was a very good bag for the IRA to blow up. They didn't see anything wrong. The electrician noted that the lectern seemed a bit wobbly. He didn't think there was anything nefarious going on. He just thought that one of the old generals or admirals or spy chiefs might have tripped over while he was trying to give his talk. Picked up the lectern and found a large IRA bomb underneath, which would have been an exciting way to end my academic career and everything else. Thatcher's committee, I could tell you many stories about that. Interestingly, the first thing I remember on that committee, it was just before she first met Gorbachev, and she asked us to brief her on the Chinese economic reforms and whether we thought they could be applied in the Soviet Union, so she could talk to Gorbachev about them. It was fun. Another great memory is having lunch with her 3 days after she was kicked out. I was a fly on the wall. I was of no importance in the job. Don't get any illusion. No, but it was a fascinating perch to watch the end of the Cold War. And of course, she was terribly vulnerable. She also, for the first time in 15 years, had nothing to do with her time. So she spoke with an openness and a hurt, a vulnerability, which was actually rather moving. It's the first time I actually liked her. I sort of had a certain admiration for her before. But I suppose you could intuit it. You could just imagine what it was like for a lower middle class woman to become head of the Conservative Party. When she became head of the Conservative Party, women were not allowed in the Conservative Party main club. They had to change the rules overnight. So that was very fascinating. Probably, though, in retrospect, the most interesting, significant, depressing memory is the lunch with Douglas Hurd, then the Foreign Secretary, again, about 4 of us, just as the Republican elections were coming over the horizon in the spring of 90. Long discussion about the possible implications of Ukrainian independence. And I don't think any of the 5 people round that table would have been very surprised at where we are now. It's horrendous and it was not inevitable, but I still remain more surprised that we didn't have mayhem in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed than that we are having it here. The collapse of great empires is usually associated with world war, civil war, you name it. The fact that the Soviet Union collapsed with barely a shot fired in its defense in 91 helps to explain why we lived in a fool's paradise. It was a fairy story. But unfortunately, the consequences of empire's collapse often take a generation to work through, and history is not usually about fairy stories. I mean, apart from being on these committees, I was in the media almost every day at that time. It was an extraordinary period of my life because I was writing history books. And of course, it was partly all that because by then I had spent 10 years teaching, or 7, 8 years teaching Soviet politics. But above all, I was someone who knew something about Soviet politics, who had a big background in the history of Imperial Russia, and specifically late Imperial Russia. I mean, the basic point about Gorbachev is that without realizing it, he reintroduced into Soviet politics, into the very center of Soviet politics, the key dilemma, and in the end, the fatal dilemma of late Imperial Russia. How do you bring in to an authoritarian Russian polity Western liberal and potentially even liberal democratic principles? How do you bring them in without collapsing the whole system? This was probably the greatest of all dilemmas for the rulers of late Imperial Russia. It was a dilemma I was very familiar with. It was a dilemma that no Sovietologist was familiar with. And also for the Sovietologist proper, for psychological reasons as much as anything else, it was simply inconceivable that the Soviet Union could disappear. Their whole lives, if it was the IR people, it was the idea of multipolarity, the 2 superpowers. for the Sovietologists proper, it was the Soviet Union was, and its existence was at the centre of their own identity almost, not to mention their jobs and their sense of status and everything. The idea that this could actually disappear and they might become mere historians was really too much to manage. I had no, particular commitment to the Soviet Union, and one reason I was, cheerfully predicting it was going to collapse, partly because I always think everything's going to collapse, so that but also because of, for me, the really serious object of my academic study was history. A speaking voice, even speaking to Thatcher, that was fun. That was my hobby really for a few years. So I was willing to chance my arm a bit more. But I did, in order to try, which was my job at the time really, to try and put what was going on in the Soviet Union, perestroika, into perspective. I basically came up with an understanding of modern Russian, by which I also meant Soviet history, which worked roughly like this. I saw the history of modern Russia as basically three great cycles of modernization, each of them launched from above by the central regime, the elite, the top leaders, and designed above all else to ensure that Russia would become and remain a truly great power within the European and then world system of great powers. Also, to some extent, to try and ensure that Russia would become a modern country of which Russian elites could be proud. But that was linked. It wasn't exactly the same thing, and it was of secondary importance, I would say. The first of those cycles I called Catching Up with Louis XIV. It begins in the 17th century. Its great hero is Peter I. The sign that Russia succeeded is the defeat of Napoleon, the Russian army in Paris, and the fact that in the first half of the 19th century, Russia is seen as Europe's greatest land power. Then along comes the Industrial Revolution, and all the factors of power are transformed. Crimean War shows, with Russia fighting and moving with pre-industrial weapons, the English and French with the technology of the Industrial Revolution, that you're into a different world. And that launches the second great cycle of modernization, which is essentially Russia and then the Soviet leaders attempting to ensure that their country remains a great power in the industrial era. And that begins in the 1850s with Alexander II's great reforms. It ends, I think, in the 1970s. And then again, just like Nicholas I, Brezhnev and co are harking on about their glories in the recent victorious war, giving themselves weapons, medals. Meanwhile, the world economy is changing again. And now one's into the world of the microchip and the computer, etc., etc. Reagan and Thatcher on the march. It seems that liberal capitalism, the computer and the microchip, is triumphing worldwide. And Gorbachev essentially launches his perestroika in order that the Soviet Union can survive as a great power, a superpower, into the 21st century, and also survive as a country in which Soviet elites can bear to live and take pride. The obvious comparison was between Gorbachev and Alexander II. This is reform from above in a liberal era on liberal principles. Whether one is talking about Alexander II at the high point of the Victorian era, or Gorbachev in the era when Reagan and Thatcher are on the march and the enemy capitalist economies are booming. And anyone, even the terminology is the same. Perestroika, glasnost, zakonnost, all these things were words used by Alexander and his entourage for the reforms. Anybody who knew about Alexander's reforms knew that Gorbachev was going to face very considerable challenges and dangers. Remember, 8 years after the demise of Nicholas I's very conservative regime, you have small but significant sections of the Russian intelligentsia calling for the overthrow not just of the monarchy, but of private property and marriage, and this is the high Victorian era. You have full-scale revolution in Poland, put down by hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. And if, you could make those comparisons, unless you were witless, you could also see pretty clearly that Gorbachev's dilemma was going to be a great deal harder than Alexander's. When Alexander rules in the 1860s, empire is the name of the game. The only even semi-democracy in the world, the United States, is tearing itself to bits in the Civil War. By the 1980s, democracy is the only game in town. Empire is anathema. Even the Soviet regime has to pretend to be a democracy. It was supposed to be a Soviet democracy, elections and all. And in its constitution, it actually says that the republics have the right to secede. So you're going to have real trouble once you begin talking about constitutional legality, etc., etc., etc. And I must say, I sat in London with utter astonishment at the naivety of a Soviet elite which could introduce these fundamental challenges to its own existence without even seeming to realize what they were doing. And there I do think their absence of any understanding of history was crucial. And this wasn't just as with the Americans going into Iraq, ignorance about history. Of course, in the Soviet case, it was that the ideology of the regime simply made it impossible to go back beyond the revolution and make these comparisons, because that would have undermined the whole idea of the revolution and the new regime itself at its very foundation. And so, that was it. And that period of my life, which was certainly the busiest, because I got married, our first child arrived, I wrote 2 books about history, and I was every day, press, etc., came to an end in absolutely symbolic fashion. I left Britain to go and have 2 years leave of absence in Japan on the day the Soviet Union collapsed. As always, I watched my television, and as always at that point, the news began outside the Kremlin, obvious crisis. But the red flag was flying. When I recovered from my jet lag and turned on my television in Japan, there we were again in front of the Kremlin, and the Tsarist flags were flying over the Kremlin, I must say. That was one of the oddest experiences in my life. Of course, jet lag and insomnia didn't help. But, watching the Tsarist, the flags of the monarchy, flying again over the Kremlin, astonishing. And that, roughly speaking, is where I'll end. My last very brief comment is that after that, I never wanted again to be much involved in contemporary politics or to write much about it. I had nothing special to add. I felt in the last years of the Soviet Union that as someone who knew about Soviet politics, but above all knew about Russian history, I really did have something to add. I had nothing special to add about Putin's, Yeltsin and Putin, except perhaps the consequences of empire's collapse. What I did was spend the whole of the 1990s researching and then writing my book, Empire, the Russian Empire and its Rivals, which was designed to, essentially put the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union into a grand scale study of empire, its rise and fall, with Russia and the Soviet Union in the middle. Then, I have to explain this a bit with autobiography. When that book came out in 2000, right back in 1985, I married a Japanese woman. She was the first Japanese woman to graduate from London Business School. She made a career in finance. So, she was not going to spend much. Well, she was always deployed around the world anyway. So I was basically the parent in residence. We had nannies. For God's sake, I would hardly compare myself with some poor, wretched single mother trying to look after children. Nonsense. But I was the parent in residence, so it was a good idea to write a book in the 1990s which did not require disappearing to Russian archives. Come 2004, after my stint as head of the government department, my children are growing up, so I could head off back to the archives. And now the military and diplomatic archives are open. So firstly, I write my book, Russia Against Napoleon. Then I write my book, Towards the Flame, Empire, War, and the End of Tsarist Russia, neither of which could have been written without the Russian military and diplomatic archives. After I've written that book, my eyes go completely crazy. So again, I revert to comparison and sum up really my entire career by writing this book, In the Shadow of the Gods, the Emperor in World History, which is literally a study of 5,000 years, but is also somehow, and of hereditary monarchy and empire as systems of rule, but is also biography. Just the last thing I'll say, to put this... Until 2011, I'm at LSE. My last 2 years at LSE, I moved to be head of the history department because they were having one of their periodic civil wars, and I came in as a sort of leader. But then I go off and become a research professor in Cambridge. By the time I was the only research professor of history in the university. This is a position of total privilege. No administration, no teaching, no responsibilities, free 16th century, 17th century suite of room, free everything. This is the closest that a British historian comes to heaven without dying. And that helped to explain why I was able to get this, certainly with the eyes. 2 ironies. The first is that because when I got the job in 2011, there's only one historian, they already had one. In theory, I got this job on my absolutely nonsensical qualifications as a political scientist. That was weak and long. It was very fun. Secondly, the last Russianist to have that job was E.H. Carr. So there was a sort of, yes, but there was a history. You might say the life had come full circle. Having said that, I have to say that nothing will ever persuade me. Not even my good friend Sheila Fitzpatrick, that E.H. Carr was a good historian of Russia, but I have a great respect for him as a scholar and theorist of international relations. So if ever we end up in some kind of, academic Valhalla, maybe we'll be able to have a polite conversation. That's it. Yeah, thank you.